The first step in winning your league is having a good draft. So today I'm going to be going over different draft strategies that you can use. The first thing you need to consider is how are you going to compare players that do not play the same position. So it's very easy to look at two centers, Connor McDavid and Nathan MacKinnon, and see that Connor McDavid gets more points per game in my fantasy league than Nathan MacKinnon. So I'll just draft Connor McDavid because they both play center. But typically, you're going to have, let's say, two centers on a typical fantasy roster and four defensemen. So you need to have defensemen, otherwise you are missing out on four roster spots. So you need to figure out, okay, which defenseman am I going to get? Well, in your draft, you will come across a point where you're debating between getting one center that you're looking at or a defenseman that you're looking at. And there are two schools of thought that I think really come into play here. The first one is just pick whoever is the best out of the two. Just always take the best player available. So in this case, the two players I want to compare here are Nathan MacKinnon and Cale Makar. Well, Nathan MacKinnon scores 4.01 fantasy points per game in my league, whereas Cale Makar scores 3.04. So it's very easy to just pick Nathan MacKinnon in this spot. But then, so keep in mind, this is an example from a shallow league that I'm in. It's literally 4 teams, but it's for an example purpose. In this league, there's another way to look at the comparison between these two players, and it's looking at their value over replacement. So a common term that you'll hear is VORP, value over replacement player. So in this case, the replacement player is essentially the best player in your free agency. So in my league, the replacement players, they probably should be owned, but some of the two of the 4 people are inactive. The replacement level center is Tim Stützle, who's scoring at 3.29 fantasy points per game. So he's the guy who I could pick up for free. I don't even have to worry about drafting him in my league. So since the replacement level center is Tim Stützle with 3.29 fantasy points per game, we know Nathan MacKinnon is scoring at 0.72 fantasy points above replacement. Whereas then you look at Cale Makar, he's scoring 3.04 points per game. And the replacement level defenseman is Vince Dunn, who should probably also be owned. He has 2.04 fantasy points per game. So Cale Makar is a full point over the replacement player per game. So you can see from this example, Cale Makar is outperforming the replacement level player by more than Nathan MacKinnon is. So in your draft, you could, take Nathan MacKinnon, just snap call that, or you could think about it in terms of, okay, but how much value am I getting over someone who I could just get in free agency by taking Cale Makar versus Nathan MacKinnon? In this case, we see that Cale Makar actually provides more value. One thing to mention is that you can see that the top center here is actually performing really well. And this center is probably the deepest position in fantasy hockey. Not probably, it is the deepest position in fantasy hockey. So a lot of people will do something what's called fading, where you purposefully pass on a position for a lot of the first half or so of the draft. So you can get, a Tim Stützle. Probably this year you could have probably gotten him around round 8 or 9, maybe even 10, because center is just so deep. There's so many different good players who play center that you don't really have to worry about getting. If you can't get one of those top superstar players like a Nathan MacKinnon, Connor McDavid, Leon Draisaitl, Austin Matthews, those are probably the 4 where I'm taking those guys first round. Then it's honestly not a terrible idea to wait and see what you can get around pick 100, because there's going to be lots of options available, like a Tim Stützle. Now let's say you get to the point where you don't really know which player is better guaranteed. The players have very similar fantasy points per game, and you're not really sure which one to go for. One thing that you can consider is the fantasy playoff schedule. So you can look at how many games a team is going to be playing in the fantasy playoffs and take the player who has more games. Because all in all, at the end of the season, the most important thing is that you win in the playoffs. It's a lot of luck because it comes down to just like 2 weeks of the season, but it's a good idea to start preparing for that early. So you can see here I have the schedules this upcoming week between Colorado and Winnipeg. So let's say you're in your draft, and I think this season Mikko Rantanen probably would have been clearly ahead of Kyle Connor, but they would have been pretty close. So let's say you're comparing Kyle Connor and Mikko Rantanen. Let's say you think that Kyle Connor is slightly better, just ever so slightly. You'd probably be wrong, but let's say that's how you were thinking. In this case, we look at the playoff schedules for Winnipeg and Colorado to make our final decision. And we see that Colorado plays 4 games in the fantasy playoffs in the finals versus Kyle Connor's 2 games. Yes, he has a game on an off night, but so would Mikko Rantanen. So in this case, it's a pretty clear-cut decision that you're going to go for Mikko Rantanen just because you get so many more games in the fantasy playoffs. Even if the points per game for Kyle Connor were 4 and Mikko Rantanen was scoring at 2.5, well, you're going to get roughly 10 points this week from Mikko Rantanen and only 8 from Kyle Connor, even though he's outperforming him by 1.6 or whatever it is. So yeah, this is definitely something to take into consideration. You will have to look at this before the draft just to kind of get an idea of which teams are in a good spot for the playoff. Something that's gotten more popular over the last few years is something called the zero goalie strategy. Essentially what people have noticed is that goalies are voodoo, and it's really hard to project how they're going to do in any given year. Look at Jacob Markstrom last year. He performed really well. Not a lot of people drafted him very high. So if you got him, then he was doing wonders for you. The problem is, let's say you drafted him again this year, you're getting someone who is significantly underperformed what the expectations were for him coming into this season. So it's really hard to determine whether someone is going to stay consistent year over year when it comes to goalies. There are obviously a few top-end goalies that you can count on, like an Andrei Vasilevsky or Igor Shesterkin has started to enter that conversation. But if you can't get one of those guys, zero goalies is essentially you either draft maybe one goalie or no goalies, and you use your streaming spots for picking up goalies, or you try to get lucky in free agency by picking up, let's say a starting goalie gets injured, you pick up their backup, and they end up performing really well and essentially becoming the starter on that team. There's always going to be situations like that, or even just goalies who for some reason weren't drafted who end up being on a really good team. So if you go the zero goalie route, you can always find a decent option in free agency, unless your league is for some reason all the goalies are taken, if you're in like a 16 team league. But yeah, I think the most important thing about this strategy is understand your league settings and how valuable goalies are. A lot of the times it's really nice to have a goalie who gets a lot of volume starts, like an Andrei Vasilevsky or a Connor Hellebuck. So I would definitely understand, is this viable? If goalies don't really get you that much, then maybe spend a couple extra roster spots in your draft on forwards, because forwards are always going to be the most consistent in terms of point production. And I think that kind of goes for everything. Just understanding your league settings and league scoring is the most important part of knowing who to draft. So yeah, just don't take the zero goalie advice if goalies are super important, but definitely consider it. If you can draft a top end goalie, obviously they're going to perform really well for you. But typically, I don't really like to spend my picks early on goalies, but instead try to get someone who is, I think, undervalued. This year, I tried to go for Marc-Andre Fleury. Didn't end up really panning out, but my team ended up doing pretty well anyway because I got him in like the 9th or 10th round. So that pretty much covers what you need to know for a snake draft. Now we're going to get into something that is specific to auction drafts. So typically, there are two approaches that you can take to an auction draft. The first one actually has a name, and it's called studs and duds. So essentially, what you do, you have a budget of about $200 that you get to use on all of your players. The idea is you want to try to get a few top end talent guys with a lot of your money, like a Connor McDavid, a Nathan McKinnon, a Nikita Kucherov, and hope that top end talent is enough to carry you, because you're not going to be able to get those types of guys all on one team in a snake draft, but in an auction draft you're able to do that. The thing is, you now have to round your team out with the duds of the team. So Connor McDavid's a stud, whoever else you get after that is going to be all the duds on your team. So the pro of this is that you have game-breaking top-end talent on your team. You are going to have a chance to steal your matchup every week just because you have those guys who can score at will. Another pro of it is, yes, you have a bunch of duds at the end of your roster, but there's always going to be players who break out throughout the season that you can drop those duds for to pick up the breakout players. So those breakout players are going to be somewhere in between stud and dud. So you're not going to actually have that many duds on your team if you are active on the waiver wire and looking for those players who are going to perform really well, at least a lot better than they were expected to. The con of this is if you miss on some of those studs that you pick up, let's say this year you drafted a Jonathan Huberdeau or Johnny Gaudreau, or pretty much, I guess Victor Hedman too hasn't had that great of a season. So if you pick these guys, your roster is going to be really, really bad because you're going to have all the duds and then your studs aren't nearly as good as you expected them to be. A lot of people thought Jonathan Huberdeau might not reach the 115 points he got last year, but maybe still be like a 90, 100-point player. But he's down to, 60-point pace. So, he's essentially a dud at this point. So you really need to make sure that you are getting those top-end guys. Try to avoid people who are going into new situations just because it's hard to figure out whether you're going to get a Jonathan Huberdeau or a Matthew Tkachuk. Yes, it would suck to miss out on Matthew Tkachuk this year, but it would suck even more to draft a Jonathan Huberdeau and have to deal with his season. So this strategy, you're going to actually notice something in your draft. The first third of the draft, you're going to be very active in bidding on these players. And then throughout the middle, you're not going to really be able to do much because your budget is so low after spending it all on those top end guys. So you're going to reach a trough and then you're going to go back up to this peak where you're drafting the rest of your players, all the $1 guys. So this is typically a strategy that I'd recommend for a more active manager who's willing to stream to try to get those players who won't be duds on your team. And you're going to have to elevate how good the rest of your roster is after those studs throughout the season. The other strategy is a more well-balanced approach. So the idea is you don't go after a Connor McDavid or a Leon Draisaitl, but instead you try to go for the more middle of the pack guys. It's hard to think. Maybe like a Joe Pavelski, who's not going to go for an insane amount of money. He's not going to break the bank in an auction draft, but you're getting a guy who's going to be around a point per game. So you get a bunch of guys who are 70, 80 point pace, and your team is going to be stacked in terms of people who are well above replacement, but you're not going to have those top end talent guys. So the pros of this are you can just set your lineup and forget it. You don't have to worry that much about looking at the waiver wire and trying to pick up players who are going to outperform anybody on your team, because your team's going to be really good. That's another thing, is it's always going to be competitive because you've diversified your team so much to the point where you have a lot of really good players, or at least players who are going to project to be really good. Even if a couple of them don't reach what they're expected to do, they are going to still be, your team in general is going to still be very good, because at least 70% of them are going to be around what you expected probably. So the con of this is, if you're someone who likes to play the waiver wire and stream and try to maximize your games played throughout a week, your worst player on your team is probably going to be too good to drop. So you're going to have to try to find some trades to be able, like 2-for-1 trades, so you can get a better player back while shipping out 2 really good players. Honestly, someone who does the studs and duds approach versus someone who does the well-balanced approach, they would actually be really good trade partners in a league. So you're going to have a tough time figuring out who to drop when you go to try to get more games in a week, especially throughout the playoffs. This week, if you have like a Kyle Connor as from Winnipeg is one of your top guys, or let's say Nikolai Ehlers, who would fit a more well-balanced approach, you're not going to really be able to drop him, and he plays only 2 games this week. So, but you'll actually notice, so this graph, it is basically the inverse of the other one. So you're going to be very inactive for the first third of the draft, but then that middle portion where all the guys who went studs and duds used all their budget, you're going to be able to snipe them on their picks, try to outbid them to the point where they're like, I don't have enough money where I could realistically go and get this guy, because it costs a lot more to them, because they're going to be down to their last dollar if they get them for, let's say, $25, whereas you're still going to have over 100 left. So you're going to be much more active in the middle portion. You're probably going to end well before anybody who did the studs and duds approach. So yeah, I would recommend this to someone who doesn't really want to pay attention too much to the waiver wire, more inactive manager, and someone who, I would say the advice I gave before about making sure you're getting guys who play in the playoffs, that is definitely something that's important for this well-balanced approach. And honestly, I would say it's also important for the studs and duds approach, because if your stud is a Kyle Connor, then you're not getting a lot of value out of him when it matters most. The last piece of advice I will give is specifically for categories leagues. And it's kind of akin to the 0 goalie strategy. So I guess you could also use it for points leagues, where you essentially, what the idea is, you punt on a category. Punting is where you purposefully do not care about certain categories so that you can bolster your team in its strengths. So let's say your goalies aren't that great. Well, maybe you just drop all your goalies in favor of picking up extra forwards or defensemen, because you can now dominate in goals, assists, shots, hits, blocks. And as much as you're going to lose the goalie categories every week, you're setting yourself up for a lot of success in the other categories. So you're definitely maximizing your games played in terms of forward and defenseman games. If you can, the idea of a Cats league is that you want to just try to get more category wins than your opponent. If you're able to do that by just forgetting about goalie categories, then that's definitely something to consider. The other category that is common to punt, just because it's so random, I guess there's actually a couple, but shorthanded points is one of them. But I was specifically thinking of plus minus. Plus minus, if you are really trying to win that, you can't really draft anyone on a bad team because they're just going to naturally pick up minuses. Look at a Jordan Kyrou this year who's on St. Louis. He's like a minus 30 something. Or a Clayton Keller on Arizona. You know, you you eliminate some of your options who otherwise would be really good players if you try to target plus minus as a category. That's pretty much it in terms of advice for going into your draft. If you guys have any other strategies that you've used that I didn't discuss in this video, please leave them in the comments. But yeah, thanks for watching. Please like and subscribe. See you guys next time.